So today we have Peter Thomas, whom you've all met by now and chatted with. So he's an historian, anthropologist, archaeologist, but very interested in preserving the records of the church in South Deerfield that will be closing. So today it's just regular Deerfield. Anyway, he's going to talk to us today.
No,
about
you're right. It's just that's one of the many. I'll tell
You'll
you why.
straighten us out.
I'll tell you why
Okay.
it was that today.
Yeah. Anyway, we're delighted to have you here.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming.
I'm not sure how we're going to do this. Is it the flip of my little pinky that's going to engage your?
Sure.
We're going to coordinate these. There are a number of PowerPoint slides to start out with because I'm going to talk about the history of this church and the church now. And the latter part of it is going to be going back and looking at some aspects of the first 30 years of the church, particularly having to do with church discipline. I thought it might be kind of fun to look at some of the human side of this and not talk about doctrine. So that's the. Yeah, you're fine. Just leave that right there.
All right.
So what prompted this presentation this morning is the church is closing its doors at the end of the year after nearly 200 years of existence. It was founded in 1818. And the Legacy Committee at the church has been working to plan that transition. What is the role of this church going to be in the community? How can we leave a legacy to the community? And so one of the things that I as a teenager, I went to this church back in the 50s and 60s. And so I'm familiar with it. My father and parents, my mother also went to this church for years. And one of the things that, as a historian, I'm particularly keen about is the preservation of records for institutions, organizations that have had a real impact within the community. And I found out that basically the clerk's records for the church minutes exist. They go back to 1818. And they consist of 9 volumes. Some of them little notebooks, some of them larger volumes. I brought one here just so you can have a look at it afterwards, but this is volume 2, and this actually contains most of what I'm going to talk about today. They're pretty legible, but you have to learn to read cursive. So what I did is acted liaison between Historic Deerfield, PVMA, and the church, so that their records are going to be transferred to PVMA, curated there. It's a nice staffed library, climate controlled, and all the works with the library staff. So, and they're used to doing historical research. One of the things that I'm hoping is that Deerfield has a History Fellows program every summer. And there's like 10 or 15 students that go there, and they're all looking for topics because the goal is to write a paper. So I think that these records would be most suitable. But what I've been trying to do is to write a sort of synopsis of what's in these records so that it gives people some guidance when they're looking for research topics. Okay, these are the kinds of things you can find in here. So I've become quite familiar with the early history of the church through this process. So Charlie was originally asked to give the talk here. He's been tied up with other church matters for transition, so a month or so ago he asked if I would step in and do the presentation, which I've given the amount of information that's in these books. It's a relatively easy thing to do. Anyway, this is the church today, and if you want to flip the next one, this is its interior. It's quite a nice looking church. The original church ended roughly here in the background. So later on, they added 20 feet to it, but the original church looked pretty much like it does today on the exterior, with a large bell tower and the double story here. Go ahead.
When was the organ put in, or is that an old organ?
The organ, I think, is it 1910?
It was right near the turn of the century, I forget
So
which
it's
side.
100 years
So
old.
we're
I think it's between 1900 and 1910.
So it's 100 years old too.
Yes.
Are those pews really curved, or is it just?
Yes,
sort of-
they're curved.
Really?
Could you
And
show
they're,
that again? Because
Go
I thought it
back,
was just
go
a,
back,
I
Alan.
thought it was a picture, I mean,
no,
it's a
they're,
distortion.
they're actually curved in a single board.
Oh,
Really?
wow.
Each pew is a single plank.
Wow.
And it's kind of interesting, when you go in, they all have cushions on them. I don't see a view that you can actually see that, but you go in and you lift up the cushion, and there's a dollar amount on the pew.
Oh,
Going
right,
from
yeah.
$45 down to $27
Oh,
down
for the
here.
Mhm.
And that dates to the later 19th century, when they rented the pews for a year. And that was the price that people paid. Well, that was the bidding place, that's where they started.
Oh,
So in the wreckage, you actually find, this pew, $45 plus $6,
Oh, cool.
and so got the pew.
Huh.
oh, was
Um,
that the whole pew price or the seat price?
Whole view.
Well, this section, that's not all the way across
No,
one
but I meant
section.
just the okay.
Each
yeah.
section sat 6 people.
Oh,
And so you actually find people buying 1/6 of a pew. And you'll notice that there's also pews in the balcony. Same thing was true here, you could buy a 1/6 of a pew in the balcony. Back seat next to a cold window, they were pretty cheap. But that's where the kids sat.
Is this an auction?
Huh?
Was this an auction?
Well, only for the pews, but it was an auction, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, you bid, and it's really interesting, because we have records by the year, and the front pews get into a bidding war. The same family doesn't own the same pew year after year. So it's, these, in the earlier days, it wasn't done by bidding, it was done by purchase. There are actually deeds to individual pews. And we have 2 volumes of deeds for these pews. And so you can go by and, figure out whose pew was whose by the deed. And these were transferred exactly the same way the property was. You could inherit them. We have sales of a pew by a lady in Northampton to somebody in South Deerfield. She obviously inherited it from somebody who had the pew. It went into the estate. They were used as collateral for loans.
Ooh.
We have people giving up their pew to so-and-so with the right to rebuy it if they
Not wealthy again.
can pay the borrowing plus the interest. So they're multifaceted. You were talking about the organ. The first time there was a choir in this church was in the 1890s. Very late. Early Congregationalism, this is where Puritanism, these are post 16th century or 17th century Puritans, the Congregational churches. In the early days, there was no singing. And then early on, it became singing, but everybody sang what they wanted to sing. So it wasn't a single hymn that everybody sang. It's, you grabbed a psalm and started, and somebody else would do the same thing next to you. And it became this cacophony of sound, and then finally people orchestrated what was going to happen in terms of services. So there is a very, very nice organ there. There's a piano down front. And hit the next slide. This is just a close-up of the pulpit and the chairs behind it, the organ.
And is the
behind
pulpit original or?
it. My guess it's a 19th century.
Late 19th,
Um,
very late.
Yeah, originally, the choir sat up here. And so people, when they sang, would sort of face up that way. I don't think this was reversed. There's some churches where these will be out towards the front and people come in and go the other way. But, so, go ahead.
Peter?
Yes.
Just one thing that might be of interest here, the original pews were priced according to the location of the stove in the church, which was at the front.
Yes.
And those were the more expensive pews. Those that weren't interested in the warmth of the stove had greater latitude in terms of where they might want to
They
stay.
actually got a furnace in 1865. And it's interesting to look through the records because that is the biggest money loser
Okay.
for this church throughout the last 100 years. It was always a question of where can we find the money to fix the busted furnace?
Yep.
Now,
Heard that.
we talk about the church as a church, but this church really played a role in this community. This is the village of South Deerfield, originally the village of Bloody Brook. And one of the things that is in this church, you can't see it because it's in the belfry up on top, is a very nice bell that came from another church in 1865. But it has rung since then. In 1910, they put the clock in, which you can see here. And at that point, they hooked the two of them up so that the bell rings on the hour, and at half hour it rings a single chime. And so that's 90 a day strokes that the bell was hit. And I gotta tell you, growing up in that town, you came to listen for that bell. It is as good as wearing a watch.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, and you can hear it, but in the early days, it was also the bell for the fire department, public meetings, you know, it took a central focus. And what you don't see today, unless you go up there, is in the belfry. This is the ceiling of the belfry with the original paint in the church. This is all hand painted. It's not real woodwork, it's all hand painted on the ceiling.
Wow.
And this is the opening. The original one was here before the clock went in, then they had to move it. So the belfry, the rope drops down here. And it's been a place of public involvement and a place to go because of the bell. The bell was not simply a church bell, it was a bell for the town. And so, go ahead and we'll have a look.
Oh, neat.
Deerfield High School,
Uh,
1895. This is the earliest one I can find on there, but go ahead, we're gonna look at a few more. Okay,
my word.
4th of July, 1907. These are the people. It became a tradition in this town to ring the bell on the 4th of July. And go ahead and hit the next one. Here's one for the 4th of July. They rang the bell for 3 hours.
Wow. Well, midnight.
But it became a place to record other significant events in history. Go ahead. This is from 1963, Ring Out for Freedom. This is the early civil rights era. And Henry Roars was the minister at that point. But 4th of July, 1963. And see, go back one. Well, there's 50 states and 187 million people living here. Okay. Okay, here's the Vietnam peace signing, 1973. This is the minister, this is his son. I went to school with him, he was a classmate of mine. Okay. 200th anniversary of the country. Here's me.
Oh,
I'd totally forgotten that until I went
is
up
that
to the
your
dump.
brother above you?
That's my father.
Or your father?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Go ahead. All right, so it's had a dual role, and when you listen to the history later on, the history is really about the people in this community as much as the people in this church. And what happened in the church, particularly in the early period, is that the church, or the people living in the community that went to the church, were the vast majority of folks in that community. So what you see happening in the church is happening, it's taken outside the church too. And it becomes a social, cultural process that's going on within the community, not just something that's within the four walls. But let's see how we get here. I'm going to begin this story in Old Deerfield, and in 1807. This is the old brick church in Main Street in Deerfield. And in 1807, the community was looking for a new minister. They'd only had about 5 in its entire history to this point. These people were staying on for 50 years. But they needed a new minister. And they had asked a young fellow from the eastern part of the state, a guy named Samuel Willard, to come and visit them and give some sermons and meet the people. And he came, and they really liked him. And so they wanted to, what they do, send a calling. They would call the minister to come to the church. But there was a process. And the process was that the minister would come in response to the invitation, but he would have to go before an ecumenical council or an ecclesiastical council, which is made up of ministers and delegates from surrounding churches, from surrounding towns. And they would get together and they'd quiz him on his orthodoxy, his beliefs, his understanding of church governance, why he got into the ministry in the first place, what did he think he could do for the community. And once they were satisfied that he was acceptable, they would move then to ordain him the minister in the church. The problem with Samuel Willard is that he was Unitarian, which is, if you know something about Protestant churches, that's not Calvinist congregationalism. And so they said, no, we don't want him here. Well, he must have been a really charming person, because the bulk of the congregation in Deerfield said, we like this guy. We're going to invite him back. Let's come back for a couple more sessions and see if we really think he'll fit in. Well, they like him. So but we've got to go through the process again. We've got to have an ecclesiastical council. So what do? They go to churches in the eastern part of the state. And that's right. They bring in the Harvardites, and they have their own council. And they said, fine, yeah, good, it's fine with us preaching here. And so they moved and ordained him. And that was in 1807, and he became the minister until 1829 when he went totally blind and had to give it up. But that left a number of people in the church who were members of the church very disgruntled. They were not about to sit and listen to a Unitarian preacher. So they said, well, what are we going to do about it? So first off, they said, well, we're going to petition the church and just let us go to some of the other surrounding towns. Well, you got to remember at this time, people are paying into the minister's tax to support the church. You start losing congregations, you start losing money. So they said no. Well, this went on for a while, and finally they couldn't take it anymore, and they said, we're going to have our own ecclesiastical council. So they had an ex parte one, found some sympathetic ministers, and they finally concluded, yeah, you can leave, you can go to other towns and find your place there. And go ahead and hit the next one. So this is the long street in Old Deerfield. This is where the church is there. They go to Sunderland. 30 people, or 30 men and their families and kids joined the Sunderland Congregational Church in 1807 and 1808. This part of Deerfield is also very lightly populated. There's very little south of the bars, which is that's in here. There's a little crossroads down here that prior to 1800 was nothing. There's scattered farmsteads along the river. There's Mill Village over in here. There's some scattered farmsteads along through here. Not a whole heck of a lot in here because it's kind of a sandy plain and not real good ag land. And prior to this happening, the scattered farmers in here had petitioned Deerfield to break away from the church because it was just too far to go. So what most of them did was to go to this church anyway. They were still paying the minister's tax, but they were going to the church in Sunderland. Now that's tough because there's no bridge. So it's taken, well, up to, later on they could, but there wasn't any ferry either. It was sort of rowboat type attendance for the church. So the folks were then in the Sunderland Congregational Meeting House for until 1818. And in that year, there was an act of legislature incorporating the Second Parish in Deerfield. So hence the name, the Second Parish Congregational Church of Deerfield. And by that point, 60 families leave the Sunderland Church and form a church here in South Deerfield. I think there's a close-up of, hit the next slide. That's the part of the act of incorporation. July, these are the men who had petitioned for this. Not particularly relevant for this particular talk, but this correlates well with the church records in the Sunderland Church, which I've also done some work on. Go ahead. So there are no early depictions of this church, but this is a surveyor's field book. A guy named Arthur Hoyt, who laid out the roads and the town boundaries in 1830. And this is the center line going up North Main Street in South Deerfield. These are the compass bearings and distances in half chains. Bloody Brook, See the cross swords? This is where the fight is in King Philip's War. Going out here, a fellow named Barnes, fairly prominent citizen in town, Eli Cooley. You'll just keep an ear out for that name. This is where he lived. I'll tell you about what he did later. And the church. And when we look at, get the next one. When we look at Arthur's 1831 map, this is his translation. So we have the church up here, Lathrop and the battles. This is Bloody Brook. This is the village of Bloody Brook. This is the Connecticut River. There is a bridge here by this point. And so it was easier to get back and forth. But if you know South Deerfield and you have Grave Street and all these other streets, this is all farmland. It's a very scattered community out here. There's some houses along and through here, but that's it. And in 1835, the Bloody Brook Monument that you can still see there today, this pillar, is right here. There's a little park for the Bloody Brook fight. Okay, so the church originally then is up here. This church is now about here. They moved it from here down to here in 1848. Okay, let's look at the next one and see where we are. Okay, so the history gets really complex, but in brief, you have the original church in its northern location until 48. In 1848, and that's kind of where I'm going to end in this talk, there had been a huge row in the church, and people walked. And the people that broke away formed the Second Congregational Church, or the Orthodox Congregational Society in South Deerfield, also became very quickly known as the Monument Church, because the Bloody Brook Monument was in the front door, or right outside the church. So the church that we're talking about continues for that period, 48 to 64. Finally, another ecclesiastical council comes in and helps them sort it all out after much haranguing, and they rejoined together in 1865, and that became the church then, the South Deerfield Congregational Church, that we knew, both of us attended, with a new name again. And if you don't think the history is complex, trying to sort out all of this, what happened. It's wonderful history. But we really do get down to dealing with individuals in terms of it playing out. So that's just briefly, and I'm not going to get us beyond here. Try the next one. Okay, just so you know then, the original church, I put this figure here, that's about what the original church, the size of it. The piece that's covered up is the 20 feet that they added on to after they rejoined in 1865. And then this is the monument church that existed. You can see the monument right here. And if you go to South Deerfield and you know the town well enough, St. James Catholic Church, that's now gone and is now in private hands. The church is closed, but it's on North Main Street. You go through from here, you go through the village and head north on North Main Street. It's on the left-hand side. That's this church, minus the steeple, with the addition of a portico and a bell tower. And if you don't think the sale of this to the Catholic parish for Irish Catholics in the 1870s didn't have a bit of, anyway, it's just one more of those things. So let's go to the next slide here. So that's what I want to talk about here on out, is the story within these walls, the human story that goes with it. And it really has to do with the people in this congregation. And by congregation, we have two, I'm not sure people quite realize what was going on at this time. You had members that had professed their faith before the congregation and had agreed to follow church rules, and they were eligible for taking communion. And you had an equal or larger number of people that didn't want to go through and adopt all the doctrine, but still really wanted to attend services. And they were not members, but they were members of the parish. So a congregation is made up of both members and non-members for services. Interestingly enough, there's also something called the parish. And most congregational churches were set up this way. The churches didn't own the property. The parishes owned the property. But the parish was made up of members who were members of the church plus non-members of the church into a whole separate body. These guys held the property, collected the money, paid the minister, took care of all the finances for the church. And so you have both church records in terms of meetings, and you have parish records. And we have some of both. And they're pretty interesting to look at side by side.
Are they all men?
Yes. Well, in our period, yes. There was an attempt in the late 1860s. Some gentleman was foolhardy enough to suggest that women should vote in a church meeting, and was soundly defeated. The first time they were actually allowed to vote was in about 1860 for one time. And it wasn't about church business. It had to do with whether they would support a missionary candidate who was heading for the Zulu in South Africa, whether they would support his ordination as a minister and support it in the church. And they let the women vote because they were going to have to put on the goodies for the party. But in terms of voting on church, 1883, they finally got the vote. And by 1889, they were actually eligible to be deacon. They call them deaconesses. And they continued from that time. So we're ahead of the suffragette movement at least by 30 years, which is pretty cool. But by that point, the church was really changing. And so let's go back, look a little bit at these things, and then I'm going to stick to a little bit of text here just to keep me on track. Go ahead to the next slide. All right. I mentioned that for people coming into the church, you had a series of what they call articles of faith. And for this particular church, and for most congregational churches, there's 11. You don't have to know them. But they cover the whole gamut from who is God or what is God. And this is where you get into God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. The Trinitarian as opposed to Unitarian concept. Unitarian is, there's God. Christ was a man who God affected but was not part of the Godhead. Whereas in Calvinist theology, all three of them were one and the same. They were just, if you will, different personifications of the same thing. And then there's a covenant. And the covenant's one of those guiding documents that is basically, if you read Calvin, or if you read the Bible, the Jews are constantly having to establish a new covenant with God, that we're going to follow you're going to be our only God, we're going to follow your direction, we'll set up a covenant, you'll help us if we honor you. Well, there's one of those in the Congregational Church. And I'm not going to read it to you entirely, but upon joining, new members entered into a covenant with God and a covenant among themselves to, quote, to walk together in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. Okay, that part we got. The next part is the interesting part, which is my takeoff for the rest of the talk. Watching ourselves and one another in the spirit of meekness, tenderness, and Christian fidelity. You pick it up? Ourselves and you. We're going to keep watch. Membership meant accepting admonition from fellow members if one deviated from the rules. Members further engaged to find and support a pious minister, to observe the Sabbath, to maintain the worship of God in their families, and to consecrate their children to God in baptism. So that's where you get infant baptism. Being baptized didn't make you a full communion member, but you were closer to the fold having your kids. And it was a sign from the congregation to God that they were dedicating their offspring to Him as well. And in 1828, they added something called ordinances of discipline, just to make it a little clearer what was expected. So, in the clerk's records, the process of seeking resolution to a perceived infraction of the rules or to moral conduct typically followed the 4 steps that was outlined by Christ in the New Testament. And if you look at Matthew chapter 18, you'll find it. But I'll read it to you so you don't have to go look it up. It's very simple. Jesus is talking to his disciples. And what he says is, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to you then, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So the following 2 cases I'm going to give you of disciplinary action. They're sort of examples of the various situations and how things were handled. In the recorded minutes of March 1st, 1826, so this is 8 years after the church was founded, we find that Deacon John Amsden reported that, quote, sometime during last winter or spring. It's interesting, it doesn't pinpoint an actual date of event. Do you think he actually saw what's going to happen? I think he went through the gossip mill. But anyway, he found out about it, and the deacon's an important person. There's only a few in the church. These are the elders, I suppose. So, sometime during last winter and spring, Mrs. or Sally Spear, Mrs. Ann Bates, and Miss Sally Clapp, quote, joined in a party of pleasure at Mr. Nim's tavern in this parish, and united with them in dancing. Conduct inconsistent with the profession of our holy religion, and contrary to the covenant engagements of this church. Subsequently, Mrs. Bates and Miss Clapp were reported to have engaged in playing cards at the dwelling house of Mrs. Spear on the evening of our parish feast or fast. Deacon Amsden stated that he had taken the first 2 steps of admonition, but had not obtained satisfaction. So he was now bringing the offense to the church. At a second meeting to hear the charges, the attending members voted in the affirmative that playing cards, joining a party of pleasure, and dancing were all disciplinable offenses. Further discussions were had over the next few months, which are laid out in about 12 pages of church records. Finally, the 2 of the 3 women were publicly admonished from the pulpit during a Sunday service on June 9th, and Mrs. Ann Bates had the sense enough not to be present, but she was sent a written copy of the admonition anyway. The second case was a lot more serious for a congregation which at that point consisted of 37 men and 66 women. One of the things with this congregation is always 2 to 1. Doesn't matter whether you're in 1818 or 1950. Had great importance because it involved the moral character and potentially criminal acts by Reverend Benjamin Rice, who had been their first and only minister since 1819. Captain William Tryon, who was one of the founding members of the church and former Revolutionary War soldier, fairly high placed in the community, obtained depositions from 3 women to what had amounted to charges of indecent exposure. Now, it's interesting that the actual charge was never included in the church records. But because the depositions were taken, we could go to the courtroom and courthouse and find out what was actually going on. So in February of 1825, Lucy Abbott was in service to Reverend Rice and living at his house. She testified, quote, Rice came in and seated himself in a chair by the fire, and I saw, as I thought, his nakedness, and felt myself injured, though I did not know that it was done designedly until I made the same discovery as he was sitting at the table. These discoveries were made through, quote, a rip or a worn-out place in his pantaloons. Susan Anderson reported a second incident that occurred in the summer of 1825. Reverend Benjamin Rice lay upon a bed with his face covered with a handkerchief. And as Reverend Rice lay on the bed, he there exposed his nakedness to me. Mary Ann Billings was with me at the same time. And a third deposition from Amanda Billings also attested to the fact that Rice had exposed his nakedness or secrets, evidently while still wearing the same pair of threadbare pantaloons. So the situation festered for the next 5 months and consumed 32 pages of the clerk's records. On July 20th, once the charges had become known to the congregation, and probably the entire village at large by this point, Reverend Rice went before the church and requested them to call an ecclesiastical council to investigate his character and to judge the expediency of dissolving the connection between him and the church. And the church agreed. So in the end, an ecclesiastical council of ministers and delegates drawn from churches in Southampton, Williamsburg, Munson, Montague, Hadley, Brimfield, and Greenfield found him not guilty of any criminal charges, but did find themselves compelled to say that, quote, much as they regret the prosecution against Reverend Mr. Rice, they cannot but think he has been peculiarly and criminally negligent in respect of his apparel and appearance, and hope he will learn wisdom by the bitter lesson of experience. So, January 30th, 1827, a second ecclesiastical council voted to dismiss Reverend Rice, but the sour feelings that were generated by this trial just reverberated through the church for the next decade. Captain Tryon, on his part, sought lesser contentious pastures and moved his entire family to Coleraine. And Reverend Rice moved to Maine and is reported to have been had successful ministries in New Gloucester and Buxton, really large, thriving Maine towns, until either dementia or insanity took hold during the final few months of his life. Well, after its past experience, the members of the church decided to avoid any ambiguity about what types of conduct were unacceptable. At a meeting on the 5th of March, 1828, it was, quote, voted that the following crimes demand the rebuke and discipline of this church: profane swearing, Sabbath breaking, disobedience to the reasonable commands of parents, murder, theft, adultery, fornication and lewdness, perjury, slander, lying, and fraud, card and dice playing, gambling of every description, dancing, or being present as a spectator at balls, reveling and drunkenness, and being disguised by the use of ardent spirits or opium, refusing to bear one's proportion of pecuniary aid in support of the gospel ministry in this parish, embracing doctrines contrary to those set forth in the Articles of Faith adopted by this church, absence from the sacrament of the Lord's Supper twice in succession, and from public worship 2 Sabbaths successively without a sufficient reason, and any other conduct not here specified, which in the judgment of this church is contrary to the rules of the gospel. We got it out, folks. So over the next 20 years, we hear the church heard confessions from Brother Eli Cooley, you remember the man, for being disguised with ardent spirits. Brother Erastus Clapp for putting away or abandoning his wife. Brother Alan Mather for using unchristian language and brandishing a deadly weapon, a knife, against his son-in-law. Betsy Sprague for refusing to pay her proportion of the support for the gospel ministry. Eli Cooley Jr. for the same and for traveling on the Sabbath. Timothy Billings for slanderous words and conduct. I think the slanderous words were, "You scoundrel." Thankful Williams for traveling on the Sabbath. Lyman Harding for joining the Methodist meeting and for making comments derogatory towards the minister. And then there's the case of Mrs. Miranda Delano, who was accused of, quote, being in company with Mr. Ashley Graves at different times and in places where it was not proper for them to be alone. A second charge of unlawful and sinful intercourse with Ashley Graves was dropped for lack of evidence. At the meeting in December of 1843, the church refused to accept a confession from Sister Delano and called for further investigation. In the end, however, Mrs. Delano, her rather benign confession was read before the church and actually accepted. While Miranda acknowledged the uproar, she admitted not a little. I certainly was not guilty of any bad intention in stopping to converse with Mr. Graves for a few moments last winter. But as it has created much excitement and grieved some of my Christian brethren, I cheerfully take this opportunity to say to you, as I did to my husband then, it was imprudent under existing circumstances. I trust you will forgive it as an imprudent act and still extend to me your Christian fellowship. One wonders, Mrs. Delano moved to Michigan. The suspicions of village gossip surrounding Mrs. Delano's conduct evidently raised the ire of some church members to a rather new pitch. At the same meeting that Mrs. Delano's case was discussed, there seemed to be an impression among the members there that there'd been a great neglect of the duty of discipline and that they had not fulfilled their covenant engagements. Therefore, Brother Dennis Ahms, Brother Dr. Allen, and Brother Sumner Dunlap were appointed to search out and attend to all the cases where members have violated the rules and bring them before the church for trial, unless previous satisfaction is made. One of the few, or much of this furor and fervor unfortunately fell on the head of one individual, a man by the name of Edwards Clark. The case of Edwards Clark began as a physical brawl between Clark and Ebenezer Morton in January of 1843. Clark decided that it was dangerous for people to drive their sleighs up to the steps of the church, so he decided to put in a fence. He was caught midstream by somebody else who didn't want the fence there. They get into this huge fight, and which runs through the church right as the tumult. And what follows is a contest of moral rectitude and Yankee stubbornness that goes through this long and convoluted disciplinary hearings and final excommunication of Edwards Clark that fills some 33 pages of records. So in the end, a small group of Edwards Clark's relatives and neighbors left the church out of protest and total frustration and established the monument church. So as the 1840s come to a close, both the church and the community of South Deerfield are really in disarray. The village's original name, Bloody Brook, more aptly described the state of affairs. This was not the community of meekness and brotherly love that the church founders had originally envisioned. Once the congregation fractured in 1848, the rancor was there for everyone in the village to see and to ponder. Where on earth would this end? And I just did.
Please do so. Will you answer a few questions?
Sure.
For some diehards? Anything?
Some diehards.
Well,
As to the ringing of the bells on the 4th of July, I've had an experience somewhat similar to that in Crete of the tolling of the bell during the time by their particular faith that Christ was to have been on the cross. I think that it was, they say, a ritual pull the bell. About 45 seconds, went on for more than 3 hours. And at the end of that time, the silence was deafening. It was just to hear this, to experience this, was an emotionally gripping thing that we don't have now. And I wonder to what extent that
Well,
may have happened.
It may.
But-
I mean,
but
even
in
I
a patriotic
pulled the bell
rather
the other
than
day, and I got a charge out of it. You know, it really is it's a whole different movement, and you don't see it, and it sort of comes from nowhere, but when you're in the bell tower, you know it.
But
Yeah.
This, I wasn't in the bell tower, I was at
Yeah.
considerable
Outside.
distance from
No.
that.
Yeah.
But it was a thing that got you in the gut, really.
Mhm.
Well, the,
And
Like
to
the
think
third-
of that as a patriotic thing on the 4th of July, I
It
mean,
was
that
a-
gets people
yeah.
in the gut too, but
and it was sort of the second or third graffiti thing in there, the ring out, and that went national.
Mhm.
That was not just this church, it was churches nationally, all rang the bell at the same
Same
time.
time.
And so that's
yeah.
very close to what you're talking
Anything else? Thank you so much for sharing all of this.
about. You're more than welcome.
Good luck with keeping those records safe and available.